I'm delighted once again, I'm sure viewers will be delighted too, to have our good friend Leith Van Onselen, the unconventional economist from macrobusiness.com.au, on board with us today. Welcome, Leith.
G'day, David. Thanks for having me on again.
Leith, one of the things that still seems to be with us is the situation concerning gas. And but before we go to that, I noticed that you've taken a position in relation to the New South Wales Productivity Commission report, and that report seems to be telling us that there's a brain drain in New South Wales. People are leaving because they can't find housing here, and the solution is to have high-rise slums across the city. And I think you've taken exception to that.
I have, David. So earlier this year, the New South Wales Productivity Commission released a report, and what it basically said was that prime-age Sydneysiders, so that's families, between whereby the heads of the household are aged between 30 and 40, are leaving Sydney in large numbers, and that's creating a brain drain because that age group tends to be the highest earning and the most skilled. And the New South Wales Productivity Commission cited expensive housing as the reason why people are leaving, which is correct. I mean, the cost of housing in Sydney is ridiculous. You've got the highest house prices in Australia, whereby the median house price, so we're talking for a detached house, is about 1.7 million. And obviously rents have gone through the roof. So they're right to be concerned. However, their solution to it was basically to deregulate the apartment market even more, so that you can have basically micro apartments can be built without car parks, without adequate storage, without sunlight, etc. And that's the New South Wales Productivity Commission's solution to the housing crisis, is basically to cram people into even more tiny houses, or tiny apartments. And that's the big solution. Now, as usual, the New South Wales Productivity Commission hasn't mentioned the obvious solution, which is to cut immigration, because New South Wales's population last year grew by 185,000 people, and all of that was through net overseas migration. So the number of people that left New South Wales versus births basically netted out to zero. So all of New South Wales's population growth has come from net overseas migration. So if there's a housing crisis that's happening, and if there's an issue with housing supply, it's been caused by excessive demand through immigration. So just to put some numbers around this, David, quickly, it took New South Wales about 212 years to hit a population of 4 million people at the turn of the century. But under the official forecast, Sydney is going to grow from 4 million people at the turn of the century to about 8 million people by around 2060. So what took 212 years to achieve is going to be achieved again in about 60 years. And that there is the underlying problem of why Sydney has an acute housing shortage. It's because its population has grown so aggressively this century, and that's projected to continue. And instead of addressing the issue at its source, which is excessive population growth through immigration, the New South Wales Productivity Commission's solution is to just pile people into even smaller apartments without natural light, without storage, without car parks, etc., which to me is just a massive step backwards in standard of living. And also comes at a time, David, when in the second half of last century, Sydney had a ginormous high-rise construction boom that led to very poor outcomes. So you had the Opal Tower, the Mascot Tower. You've had widespread building defects across Sydney, and Bronwyn Weir, who chaired the report on the flammable cladding across Australia, she estimates that half of all high-rise apartment towers that have been put up have major defects. So why are we going down this road of piling people into high-rise shoebox apartments where it was such a demonstrable failure at the end of last decade when we had the massive high-rise apartment boom? Surely the solution here is not to just keep funneling more and more people into our major cities and then shoveling them into high-rise dog box apartments that are very poor quality. Surely the solution is to slow immigration and stop our cities from expanding at such a rapid rate, because the solution here by the New South Wales Productivity Commission is a massive degradation of living standards. I mean, who wants this? Who wants to force future Sydney-siders into high-rise dog box apartments that are incredibly poor quality? Because that's the future that we're facing.
Well, you're absolutely right there, Leith. The Minns government should be standing up to Canberra instead of trying to accommodate Canberra in its madness, in its incredible amount of immigration, and leaning backwards for the universities in their rort of international education. But the other thing that the Minns government should do is correct what a previous Liberal government did, and they allowed the inspectorate, the people who actually inspect the quality of buildings, they allowed that to be privatised, but you were allowed to have your own inspector. And naturally, your own inspector wasn't that inclined to be tough on you in maintaining standards. The governance of New South Wales is in a mess, as is the governance in Australia. Talking about a mess, what about the gas policy? There seems to be a state of madness there. Is it incompetence, or is it something worse, do you think?
Absolutely. It's absolutely incompetence. So David, just literally, yesterday, so talking about, Wednesday, the Western Australian government, which has had a domestic a West Coast reservation scheme on their gas since 2004, and it's been hugely successful. So basically, in 2004, the Carpenter government at the time implemented a reservation policy for Western Australian gas, which basically said that 15% of all gas must be reserved for Western Australians first before it's exported. And what that's done is it's delivered Western Australians cheap gas and therefore cheap electricity prices, because gas sets the electricity price. And even when Russia invaded Ukraine and the world had a massive spike in global gas prices, Western Australians were unaffected because of this domestic reservation policy. Now, just on Wednesday, the Western Australian government reaffirmed that reservation policy and actually tightened it further. So they've basically threatened the gas companies that if they don't supply that 15%, and they're going to be penalised. They've also implemented use it or lose it laws, which basically say that if these companies try and hoard their gas, it'll get taken away. And they've also implemented a stricter reservation policy on all new future gas supplies for Western Australians. So we have the Western Australians looking after, the Western Australian government looking after Western Australians. But here on the East Coast, there is absolutely no appetite to reserve gas. And we're suffering major shortages here. We export nearly 3/4 of the gas to China and Japan, who are getting more of our gas than they need. They're re-exporting it for profit. And as it turns out, through Freedom of Information requests, received by former independent Senator for South Australia, Rex Patrick, the Department of Industry and Energy in Australia, so this is the federal government department, has explicitly recommended against reservation to the federal government. And the reason for this is they admit that it would provide lower prices for Australians and it would guarantee supply for Australians. But they've come up with this spurious argument, which has been basically backed by the Petroleum and Resources Lobby, which is the main lobby for the energy exporters, that reservation would be inefficient. It would act as a subsidy to Australians, as it should, and that they've also argued that it would reduce future investment in gas, which is just ludicrous, given that Western Australians has had a reservation policy since 2004, and they've had an absolute investment boom. And the United States, which is the world's biggest gas exporter, has a reservation policy. They've seen massive investment. Qatar, which is tied with Australia for number 2 as a gas exporter, has a reservation policy. They've had massive investment. So effectively what we've got here, David, is we've got our own energy department in the federal government is basically in bed with the gas cartel and is working against Australians and has recommended against domestic gas reservation because it would, A, hurt the gas cartel, and B, they argue that we can't risk reducing our gas supplies to China and Japan and Asia when they get more of our gas than we need. Like, this is absolutely treasonous behaviour here by one of our federal bureaucracies. And as a result, the federal government has done nothing about the gas crisis on the East Coast, and we're stuck paying these absurdly high prices that are at least 3 times more than what Americans pay for gas, and we're stuck with high electricity prices as a result, and we've got perpetual gas shortages despite the fact that we sell nearly 3/4 of it to Asia. It is just ludicrous.
I remember when all this was being discussed, there were those who argued that it went against the principles, sound economic principles, to have a reservation policy, because this was artificial and you should really just domestically pay for the price that you can achieve internationally. Well, what's your view of that?
It's the most stupid argument I've ever heard.
Yes.
Can you imagine a Middle Eastern country, which is swimming in oil, paying $2 a litre for petrol? It just wouldn't happen, and that's what we're doing here with gas. And the argument from the federal bureaucracy is that we can't possibly have domestic gas reservation because it would harm our customers in Asia. Meanwhile, they're happy to harm their own constituents in Australia. Like, can you imagine the Saudi Arabian government telling its citizens, no, sorry, you've got to pay $2 a litre for your petrol because we need to provide that oil to Americans and Australians? Like, it just wouldn't happen. These are the idiots that we have governing this country. And David, we've turned a comparative advantage.
Yes, that's exactly.
Australia's used to have a comparative advantage of cheap energy. Now we've turned it into a disadvantage.
Yes,
it's crazy.
I thought that was the whole point of international trade, that you relied on your comparative advantage. And other countries had their comparative advantages, and that's why you traded. That's what I thought.
100%. I mean, it's basic economics, but unfortunately, you know, we have these clowns that govern us that have now want to turn cheap and abundant resources and energy that Australia has naturally into a disadvantage. And as a result, we have a manufacturing industry that is dying because cheap energy is a key input. And that's the one area where we used to be competitive and now we're not. And it's also driving up inflation across the economy because energy is a key input to everything. So if you increase the cost of energy, so we're talking about gas and electricity prices here, you're going to push up inflation across the economy because it's a key input to everything, whether you're a cafe, a brick maker, a household, etc. This is adding to the cost of living. It's adding to inflationary pressures. And then as a result, we end up with higher interest rates than we should as well. Like, this is just madness here. And the Western Australians are cotton on to the fact that it's madness, and they've got policy which is working in their interests. And this is the crazy thing, David. We have a controlled experiment in Australia whereby the West Coast is doing one thing, the East Coast is doing the other. The West Coast has a great outcome, the East Coast has a terrible outcome. Well, surely if you're the government of Australia, go, hang on, West Coast is doing that, it's working, how about we copy the West Coast? Like, it's a no-brainer, it's a policy no-brainer, and yet our weak government refuses to do anything, and it's saddling us with extortionately high gas and electricity prices as a result. It's just madness.
And I think you were saying that Senator Patrick, when he tried to get a copy of that advice, which went to the government, when he tried to get a copy of that, he was refused that, and the government used a team of lawyers to persuade the appeal tribunal to confirm their position and not to release a policy which should be made public. It's a matter for all of us, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you know, so Senator Patrick. So what David's referring to here is the dying days of the last government, the Morrison government in December 2021. So we're talking about 6 months before the election, was presented with an options paper to reserve gas. Obviously, the election came along, change of government, etc. Rex Patrick tried to make that options paper public. So he did a Freedom of Information request that was blocked. He then spent $1,200 of his own money to take it to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, whereby Rex Patrick was then confronted with a conga line of highly paid, taxpayer-funded lawyers who argued that this paper should not be released because it could upset our trading partners in Asia who receive our gas, so China, Japan, etc. And the AAT, another treasonous mob, ended up ruling in the lawyer's favour against Rex Patrick. And as a result, this options paper that taxpayers paid for because, it's a government-funded paper and the analysis was done there, is now precluded from being released to the public. And the reason, because it might anger our customers of our gas, who are getting more gas than they need and reselling it for profit. This is just madness. And at the same time, David, we're all being told that we have to cut our gas use for fanciful, for net zero reasons. Yet Australian households use about 1/3 of the gas that we use to literally freeze it, to put it on a ship, to send it to China so that China can then use our gas, and Japan. So it's just absurd. At the same time as Australians have been told that we've got to get off the gas to meet net zero, we are literally using 3 times as much gas to freeze it to then sell it to Asia.
Yes.
So surely, wouldn't it be better for the environment if we just didn't sell as much of that gas, didn't have to freeze it, which is a highly wasteful process, and we just used it ourselves? But this whole net zero scam is just ridiculous.
It is a scam, you're so right.
It is a scam.
If you follow the money, it ends up in Beijing. Just on one thing which is being talked about now, we know what a recession is. We have a rough idea what a recession is, the general public. What is a per capita recession?
So a per capita recession is the thing that actually matters. So a technical recession, which is the normal recession that everyone hears about, is when the nation's GDP, which is the overall activity in the economy, falls for 2 consecutive quarters. A per capita recession is basically that, but adjusted for population growth. So Australia's economy, just to give you a quick rundown, the Australian economy grew by 0.2% in the June quarter, but our population grew by 0.6%. So what that meant is the overall economy grew slightly, but per person, we actually went backwards by 0.4%. And in fact, per person, the Australian economy has shrunk for 6 consecutive quarters and 7 of the last 8 quarters. Now, that's the longest continuous decline in per capita GDP in modern history. It's not the deepest, but it's the longest. So all it basically tells you is the thing that's kept the economy afloat is massive population growth and also massive government spending, because most of the growth that Australia has generated, I'm not including population growth here, has been through government spending, and the private sector is actually shrinking.
So the politicians and the bureaucrats like the idea of being able to explain that we're not in recession because we're bringing in a lot of people, and all of those people increase the gross domestic product, and therefore we're not in recession. But by bringing in those large numbers of people, all of us get poorer. The country's not richer, the country gets poorer, but they say, oh, we're not in recession, but we actually really are. And that seems to be happening to other countries, doesn't it? It seems to be happening to New Zealand and Canada too.
That's right. It's really an Anglo disease at the moment. So, New Zealand, Canada and Australia all run pretty much the same economic model. We just bring in massive amounts of people. We've been the fastest growing population growth economies this century, and Australia's actually been the fastest out of the 3. And basically, Canada and Australia have skirted a technical recession through massive population growth. New Zealand has been sort of in and out of a technical recession, but once you strip out population growth, it's fallen very heavily. And all 3 countries have basically been going backwards and trying to mask it with this huge population growth through immigration. So the United States is the outlier. The United States has actually experienced quite strong growth and also, fairly decent per capita growth, because its economy has actually been growing in per capita terms, whereas the rest of the Anglosphere has basically been going backwards.
And very quickly before you go, I saw a piece by yours which said that international students cheating is systemic. Is that your view, that this is an essential part of the business that the universities are involved in, that they tolerate a significant degree of cheating?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been well documented for a decade, all the way back in 2014. And I've actually, on macrobusiness.com.au, documented the last 10 years of multiple reports of cheating scandals. And it started, I went back to 2014, and in 2015, Four Corners did a huge huge episode on cheating by international students. It was followed up in 2019 by another Four Corners report. There's been copious, print media reports ever since. And, just in the last 6 weeks, we've also had multiple reports of, systemic cheating. And the latest round's been focused on Sydney University, which is actually the most international university in Australia. It has half international students. And effectively, unfortunately, the universities have turned a blind eye to this for around a decade because they know if they start failing students and cracking down on them, less will come here. So instead, last month we received a whole bunch of reports from The Guardian, which actually did a great job on this. And they documented a whole bunch of, they interviewed a whole heap of academics at universities who've been told that they cannot fail international students because it puts the business model at risk. And it turns out that we've been handing out prestigious degrees to international students who cannot speak functional English, do not know the coursework, and have basically been allowed to pass. And this is just a disastrous situation.
Yes, you only need to speak to Australian students to see what's going on and how irritated they are, particularly by group assignments, for example. Leith Van Olsen, thank you once again. You make a magnificent contribution to the understanding of what's really going on in this country. I do recommend that people do get your newsletter, and you can get that easily at macrobusiness.com.au. Thank you, Leith. Until next time.
Thanks, David.